Hello, my name is Veronica Lee. I am a second-year PhD student at the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy at University College London. Today, I will be presenting the initial results of our study that is being conducted with my supervisor, Dr. Carla-Leanne Washbourne, as well as Professor Yasminah Beebeejaun of the Bartlett School of Planning. And our study is titled Social Media Data for Inclusive and Salient Energy Policies in the United Kingdom. So firstly, I would like to paint a picture of the evolving energy crisis in the UK. The United Kingdom has been affected by several issues that are overlapping and occurring at different timescales, as well as at different levels of urgency. So in the long term, the United Kingdom is affected by climate change and other issues. In the medium term, one of the primary issues that is severely affecting the United Kingdom is the EU referendum, or more commonly known as Brexit, which is leading to widespread changes in how the UK implements policies. And in terms of immediate and sudden issues, this would include the problems such as the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which have to lead to very immediate responses. And all of these issues at different timescales have affected energy prices, which have sharply increased in the UK and have disproportionately affected poor households. And at this moment, seeing this constantly evolving energy landscape in the United Kingdom, we think that more than ever, we need real-time data on citizens' concerns to ensure that the energy policies that are developed by governments can be salient and address those exact concerns. And to this effect, we think that social media would be very helpful in terms of generating those insights on citizens' priorities and needs at this very, very volatile time. Borrowing from the language of the United Kingdom's government, we recognize that there is significant value in the social media data that can be used for public policy. From the government lens, it's very helpful to collect insights from social media data because social media can share real-time responses to events at a very large scale, allowing governments to very efficiently understand energy priorities and concerns at the moment. And from a user perspective, social media platforms can be very empowering, allowing individuals to build networks, coalitions, and communities, and more through an enhanced capacity to interact. We have seen this in examples of large-scale organizing and advocacy, for example, looking at Fridays for Future and school strikes for climate. And furthermore, the current literature landscape confirms these views and the value of social media. From an analytical and theoretical lens, subjectivism acknowledges that public policies arise often from a deliberative process that allows stakeholders to interact, to debate, and to collaborate on policy issues, instead of simply relying on evidence based on experts. From an empirical foundation, we recognize that there's been an increasing number of studies on social media and how it can be used in the context of public policy, such as how insights can be scraped for efficient understanding of public opinion on public policies. Governments are already using social media in order to communicate with citizens and to disseminate information. Most notably in recent years on the COVID-19 pandemic. And there are also a corner of studies that are looking at the intersection between social media and online platforms, public engagement, and also energy policy, which sets the foundation for our study. And as we were looking through this literature, a few questions arose, especially surrounding data ethics. The first being around consent. So are people aware of how their data is being used in these studies or in public policy? Because even though they may be exposed to terms of service or privacy policies, in reality, they may not be aware of these fine details. They might not be aware of exactly how their data is being used at any given time. And if they had been aware of those specific situations, they might want to revoke their consent. In terms of representation, whose voices are being amplified? Is there equal representation across many groups, and are marginalized voices heard, or are the loudest voices or the most extreme voices the ones that are being considered? From a governance perspective, how should private online spaces be governed? Specifically looking at the acknowledgement of social media platforms being owned by private companies, and therefore we need to think about how insights can be transferred from a private space into the public policy sphere. And finally, looking at the issues of surveillance, whether from governments or from private companies. So how can data be used to extract that value that we are speaking about, that the UK government in particular is emphasizing, while safeguarding the privacy and rights of citizens? So we do hope to address those questions to some effect in our study through the following research objectives. Firstly, to analyze the current energy policy research landscape and identify whether there are any gaps in knowledge, including the ones that we had thought of in the previous slide. To identify opportunities and barriers to using social media as a participatory tool in energy policy. And lastly, to understand how social media could be used to develop salient energy policies in the United Kingdom, which is our ultimate objective. From a research design standpoint, we have decided to break up our study into three key areas of methodology. Firstly, we conducted a systematic literature review, which I will primarily be presenting for the remainder of this video. And that is to complete the first research objective of understanding any gaps in knowledge. And then we will conduct focus groups and interviews to understand how people interact on social media with regard to energy policy, and also how they interact in physical spaces for the purpose of participating in energy policy. And finally, we would conduct social media ethnography to further understand in practice how social media spaces are used in order to facilitate discussion, further interaction, even organizing. And we wanted to acknowledge a few project challenges up front, which were firstly defining energy policy, because energy policy has very blurry borders when it comes to overlap with other policy areas such as transport, health, and the economy. And we also want to select the right keywords in order to make sure that we have a holistic understanding of, to thoroughly capture the literature that is presented. So if we should use words such as energy transitions and discourse or governance. Finally, in our systematic literature review, we decided to settle on the following query structure. For fields, we used keywords, author keywords, or all fields. For the terms, we used energy policy and social media as structured within these square brackets. And the date of data collection was October 24th, 2022. As for the criteria of the literature that we would include in the study, we wanted to make sure that the main focus of the study would cover 4 areas of public energy policy, with the emphasis on the word public, so that the insights would not be limited to, for example, private companies or to educators, but rather to governments and to more broadly understand public policy and governance in the area of energy. And the 4 categories that we looked at were fuels or sources such as renewables or fossil fuels, economies, mainly looking at exploring market incentives for energy policies or how those incentives can trigger behavioral nudges to consumers. Infrastructure such as smart grids and buildings, as well as social issues of energy justice, energy poverty, and trust in government and salient policies. As for the studies that we excluded, we looked specifically at studies that might cover energy policy to some degree, but are actually more heavily focused on adjacent policy issues of transport, health, education, and so on, or also to exclude any papers that are irrelevant. And the document types that we constrain our study to are journal articles, book chapters, and conference proceedings. So the process of our systematic literature review is as follows. Firstly, after this query process, we identified 868 documents via commonly used databases and registers such as Web of Science, Scopus, and Science Direct. And we also had a handful of studies from other methods such as Google Scholar and backward citation. 31 documents were excluded due to there being duplicates across the many sources. And there were 41 documents that were excluded because of their irrelevant document types, such as literature listings or editorials and commentaries. Then when we were screening the documents, we identified 799 documents whose abstracts or introductions or highlights we screened. 252 of those documents had irrelevant abstracts, and 1 document was suspected of plagiarism based on its abstract contents, so it was also removed. Then we looked at the eligibility of the documents, which were at this point 556 documents. And of these 556 documents, 10 of them were originally considered for extraction at the screening stage, but they were reintroduced because after looking at the full text, we considered the documents as relevant for the study. And then we further excluded 44 documents due to minimal or no mention of energy policy. Finally, we wanted to include a relatively large corpus at first, looking just broadly at energy policy, and this included 512 documents, which were primarily 484 journal articles, 3 conference proceedings, and 25 book chapters. Of these studies, we identified 64 that had an overlap in energy policy as well as social media. However, these studies often focused more on the value aspect of collecting social media data rather than the ethics or inclusion aspect, which are consent or representation, for example. And conversely, these kinds of issues were more commonly addressed in studies that looked at energy policy and public engagement traditionally. And there were a much more significant number of these studies, specifically 209 of them. But they tended to use more traditional research methods such as focus groups and interviews or annual national surveys. And so that misses out on the value of social media that allows for efficient and large-scale data collection, as well as the implications that could be applicable to online spaces. Now, there were a few studies that did have overlap across all three of these areas. Specifically, there are 27 documents that did so. And this is the primary set of studies of interest where they would generate insights on all fronts, whether that is on data governance or on public participation. And I'll just quickly describe the characteristics of the corpus, especially focusing on the studies that have discussed energy policy and social media. So here you can see that their initial studies that did look at energy policy and social media were published in 2013, following a gradual increase in social media adoption, and there being a peak in 2020 after a noticeable rise. And then as for the most popular journals, regardless of whether the documents were covering only energy policy or all three areas or some mix of the three dimensions, the two most prominent journals were Energy Research and Social Science and Energy Policy. As for the most frequent topics relevant to the four areas that we identified, the first were fuels, being renewables, solar, nuclear, and coal. There were many topics related to economies, mainly looking at market behaviors and also market incentives and how to influence the behavior of consumers specifically, rather than framing individuals as citizens. From an infrastructure standpoint, there were quite a few studies looking at either the energy technologies, such as renewable energy technologies or smart grids and electricity transmission, or also the data side of infrastructure. So that includes also the social media platforms. And finally, there are many studies on social issues, such as looking primarily at public opinion, perceptions, and acceptance and support of public policies in energy. And there were also some studies looking at public engagement in more detail and local and community participation, or even community-led initiatives. And as for the common methods that were used in these studies, most of them, again, as a reminder, being that these studies looked at both energy policy and social media, most of those methods were often machine learning or computer assisted, such as sentiment analysis, emotion analysis, social network analysis, and discourse analysis. So this makes use of a significant corpus of social media posts in order to generate information about public opinion and perceptions. And then there were also methods such as case studies, surveys, modeling of behaviors, and specifically when analyzing the many social media platforms that exist, Twitter was the most commonly referenced, possibly due to the available infrastructure for easily accessing and scraping social media posts. Other methods that were applied included interviews and focus groups, as well as literature reviews. And through this analysis of the methods, the topics, and the gaps that were identified in this literature, we identified firstly implications for research. One is that we would like to consider and open up a dialogue on rethinking methodology for data ethics, primarily being that when social media is used for energy policy, as I mentioned, based on the methods that were commonly used, there are concerns of consent of these participants in these studies, especially since there have already been there is already evidence that in many cases some of the participants are not aware of their social media posts being used for specific studies, and that they would be uncomfortable even though they might have they were expected to have provided consent based on their use and their so-called acceptance of terms of use and privacy policies. We also want to further look into fair representation for social media scraping, understanding that there could be many biases in the process. And in order to respond to these data ethics issues, we want to also further encourage interdisciplinary collaboration on energy policy research, because as discussed in the rundown of the systematic literature review process, the data science approach to scraping social media posts raises some questions about data ethics that could be and inclusion that could be responded to using insights from public engagement studies, and social sciences could benefit from understanding also the processes of data science in order to extract the value of these social media posts. And then we can further then incorporate that into our knowledge of public policy in order to translate those insights into the public sphere. And speaking of the policy implications, we understand that more work on inclusion and empowerment is necessary, because many of the papers adopt a very top-down model of knowledge sharing and policy implementation, such that they often recommend governments to pay attention to the public opinions on social media and to potentially also conduct scraping of their own. And this leads to almost a favoring of passive engagement over active engagement. But if we can further explore how citizens could have more agency, then that opens up far more opportunities for social media to be used in an equitable and just way for energy policy. We would also like to discuss how we can rethink how personal data is governed for public policy, specifically making sure that people are very informed with regard to their consent and their use of social media platforms, so that they can be active agents in this in the process of data transfer in the energy policy space. And many of these insights, whether they are the research implications or policy implications, transfer to the UK context as well. From a research perspective, researchers have acknowledged that there is bias in sample selection, as well as potentially in linguistic analysis, such that we may not understand the nuances that are present in specific communities online. And that methods should be expanded beyond, as I had mentioned before, sentiment and emotion analysis. From the policy implications perspective, scholars have noted several areas of improvement for energy policy and social media in the UK, being that the first being discursive failure and contestation, which mainly refers to users not having constructive discussions because of extreme polarization and lack of consensus. And so we should explore how to facilitate these more constructive discussions and areas of potential collaboration in order to help energy policy proceed. There also appears to be some mismatch at different scales of governance, and this is particularly the case where the national government tries to implement energy policies in a way that does not meet local needs. And so we need to address this to make sure that the energy policies are accepted at the local level to facilitate trust in government, and also to make sure that these energy policies are salient and credible and legitimate. And lastly, there is a need for ethical cross-sectoral data sharing, which essentially is a transparent process of data sharing that allows, that also protects users and allows the private sector, citizens and governments and other stakeholders to effectively collaborate and to build a system of trust. So following the systematic literature review, I want to quickly mention the next steps of our project. In the first quarter of 2023, we will refine the research design of the next areas, especially the social media ethnography aspect. In the second quarter, we will apply for research ethics and make sure that the research design is finalized and to start to conduct some initial data collection. In the second half of 2023 and the first half of 2024, we aim to conduct social media ethnography and interviews to collect that data. And then in 2024, the second half of it, we want to conduct a thorough comparison of participation in physical and online spaces and to see if there are any insights that could be transferred across the two, and in order to improve public participation in a just and inclusive way in energy policy. And lastly, the results will be written up in the first quarter of 2025. So thank you very much for listening to the presentation. And if you have any further questions or would like to discuss further ideas following this video presentation, please feel free to contact me through the following avenues. Thank you very much.